Hello, my name is Wanda Foley. I'm a food preservation consultant for the Becker County Master Gardeners. Our organization is sponsored by the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm joining you today to talk a little about food preservation history. We will be talking not only about history of food preservation, but also about how it has evolved over the centuries, and even some recent updates. We will look at how the processes are the same, but yet different, mainly from a safety perspective. Today we better understand the principles of canning safety, even since your grandmother's time, which is relatively recent when we're talking about a historical perspective. So let's get started. During ancient times, and we're talking about around 12,000 BC, hunters and gatherers were continually on the move, mainly to prevent starvation. They couldn't stay in one place for very long because food became limited. They had to keep moving on, searching for new food supplies when plants and animals were becoming increasingly limited at their current location. So out of necessity, they needed to find methods to gather and hunt during times of plenty, and then use some sort of preservation technique so that they could save their food for later use, thereby extending the amount of time that they had adequate food supply. Sun drying of those foods is the earliest known preservation method. It began in the hot, dry areas of the world because hot sun and low humidity was a resource they had, and they could take advantage of it. People dried fruit, vegetables, and meats. The preserving power of sugar was believed to have been discovered around 500 BC. They took overly ripened fruit, and rather than letting it go to waste, they would cook it down, and it would thicken by the power of its own natural pectins. They then add sugar. The sugar added taste, and it also had preserving powers of its own. And this practice resulted in a primitive form of what we would now call jam. Curing with salt brine was practiced during medieval times. Salt dehydrates much like sun drying did, and it would kill the bacteria by that dehydration action. Life needs water. So canning allowed mankind to make this enormous jump toward the area of food preservation, both at home and for large-scale populations. You can see on the left there a can from the early 1800s. This particular one was made in London. Nicolas Appert, he was a Frenchman, and he invented the first method of canning. It involved putting food into jars, heating them to get expansion of the contents, and then as the jars cooled, the contents contracted again, and that would form a suctioned seal that eliminated oxygen from the jar. And it was Napoleon Bonaparte, the French military leader we all know, who pushed for a more practical way of carrying food into battle to prevent illness and scurvy among the troops. In other words, a healthier diet to keep their immune systems up during those long hauls in battle. He offered 12,000 francs to a person who could come up with a practical solution. Appert won those 12,000 francs. The first pressure canner is credited to a descendant of Appert, and that came along in about 1851. And then later, in 1864, Louis Pasteur discovered the relationship between microorganisms and food spoilage. It really wasn't known why the canning worked before that time. And then that discovery, of course, led to pasteurization of milk and dairy products. So when we talk about industrial food preservation versus home-style food preservation, we can see a divergence in the methods. Today, advances in industrial food preservation go in a direction of irradiation and chemical preservatives and other efficient methods that they have for treating large volumes of food. Although we often frown upon the use of preservatives, we can't deny that they have allowed us to successfully feed the majority of the planet by using them. But for those of us who like to preserve our own food, we are fortunate in that it can be done without any or minimal chemical preservatives. The old principles are still used, but we better understand them, and we can safely preserve food with minimal equipment, a clean area, and heat. So remember, we said that drying is the oldest method of food preservation, and we know that it's still used today. The art never really left us. Today, backpackers, hunters, survivalists, and even moms find drying fruit and vegetables to be a fun and useful activity. Dried fruit and vegetables become less heavy, less messy, and take up less room, so they are portable for the camping and hiking trips. It also makes a great snack for school lunches. Sun drying of the past used to depend on factors people didn't always have control over, like the weather, humidity, flies and rodents, and a stable heat source. Today our conditions are much cleaner, and we have better equipment and have learned much from the research of the past and also the continuing research of the present. So I can offer you a few tips on drying. Drying your own herbs is a popular thing to do today, and the best methods depend on the types of herbs. These tips are very basic, so if you are interested in more information, please contact your county extension office. I'll give you the Becker County contact information at the end of this presentation. So for drying herbs, maintaining color seems to be a common problem. According to celebrity cook Alton Brown, if you do a 15-second blanching, that will help preserve the color. Otherwise, most extension offices just recommend that you dry the herbs indoors and do it out of the sun, and that will help preserve the color. Microwaves can actually be used for some herbs. Parsley, basil, celery do well in a microwave. A food dehydrator is handy if you intend to dry higher volumes of fruit, vegetables, meat, like making jerky. You can also dry herbs in that. If it doesn't seem worth the investment or you don't really have room for more kitchen toys, an oven put on the lowest setting and the door ajar works just fine. You just need to watch for burned edges on things because you are using a little hotter temperature than you would be with a food dehydrator. And then sturdier herbs like rosemary, sage, thyme, they're kind of woody, but also parsley too. Those can be tied up and hung to dry. Then there's high moisture herbs. Those would be like basil, oregano, tarragon, lemon balm, and mint, and those could tend to mold. So they do better if they're hung in a paper bag, and then you'd want to put holes in that paper bag. So the paper bag itself will absorb some of that excess moisture, and the air holes allow the moisture to then escape. And then the bag will also, if pieces fall off, you have it contained within the bag. Now we'll talk about fermenting. Fermenting is really not widely used today, but hobbyists, minimalists, environmentalists, and those with historical interest may find it an enjoyable and worthwhile activity. It might be one of those things that you just want to try once in life and then maybe be done with it, because it is quite time-consuming and takes a lot of patience. And pickles and sauerkraut are the two most common examples of fermented foods. Fermenting is more complicated than regular pickling. It's about a 3-week process and longer if your storage temperatures aren't optimal. It can take up to 6 weeks to make a batch. Sauerkraut is a good way to use up excess cabbage, but as with brined pickles, patience is really a must. Modern pickling with vinegar is much easier. As with any food preserving, you need to follow trusted instructions carefully and don't cut corners. By trusted, I mean consult your extension office. They have online resources too, or use online information from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. So now we'll move to canning. Canning is the most recent method of food preservation. I really want to emphasize safety. In 1993, the most recent safety recommendations were published for home canning. This is why you have to be careful of recipes published before that year. And I'm sorry to say that Grandma's recipes in those old 1950s cookbooks should not be trusted. They were based more on tradition rather than science, and today's standards are backed by scientific research, and so you must find recipes from those reliable sources. Food poisoning still exists today, and it isn't worth the serious, potentially fatal consequences that can result from underprocessed canned food. So use approved guidelines, and those would be like the University of Minnesota Extension or any state extension. Every state has their own extension, so any of those could be trusted as long as it's post-1993. The National Center for Home Food Preservation, as I mentioned earlier, and then Kerr and Ball, those are companies that make supplies for canning, and those companies do have safe publications. You just want to, again, make sure that they're dated 1993 or later. So if you would pick up anything at a garage sale, make sure that the date is safe. You've probably all heard of botulism. Clostridium botulinum, it's a bacteria that produces a neurotoxin, and it's capable of causing fatal paralysis. It mainly works by depressing your lungs, so it paralyzes those muscles that are responsible for your breathing, and you can actually die from the inability to breathe. This bacteria grows in low acid foods, like canned vegetables and low acid fruits. It also requires an anaerobic environment, and by anaerobic we mean little to no oxygen, like a sealed canning jar. So a sealed canning jar is not all you need to prevent botulism. Clostridium botulinum is the reason we use pressure canner for low acid foods. The spores of the bacteria can survive water bath canning, so you must utilize that pressure canner. Now we're going to talk about water bath canning first. So this is not pressure canning. Water bath canning, whether or not you need a pressure canner depends on what you are canning. High acid foods do not require a pressure canner. Water bath canning is sufficient to kill whatever needs to be killed in a high acid environment. Clostridium botulinum can't survive in high acid. So examples of high acid foods are tomatoes, but I will caution you, when canning tomatoes, you need to add bottled lemon juice. And the reason I say this and make a point of this is because with current breeding of low acid tomatoes like Roma tomatoes, that's popular today. And so that means that you can't always depend on having high enough acidic tomatoes. So you have to add bottled lemon juice, not fresh fruit lemons, because you can't assure the acidity, but the bottled lemon juice is of a specific acidity and it is high enough to prevent botulism. Peaches, pears, apricots, apples, those are also high acid foods and they can be water bath canned. So again, find and follow approved recipes exactly. Refer to accepted standards regarding the time that you need to water bath. Times can vary depending on the food, the jar size, your elevation. So pay particular attention to those and look up your times. Still talking about water bath canning, pickles. Any kind of pickle can be water bath canned. Make sure your vinegar is 5% acidity and do not use homemade vinegars. The acidity of a homemade vinegar can't be assured. Again, follow the recipe exactly to ensure the vinegar, the food, and the water proportions are correct. If you add a little extra food to get a few more pickles, or you add too little vinegar, too much water, those all change the proportions and you could get an unsafe food product as a result of that. Use pickling or canning salt, not iodized salt. Either white or apple cider vinegar can be used. Apple cider vinegar may discolor light foods, for instance, if you're pickling cauliflower. And the flavor does differ a little bit between the two vinegars, so it's kind of what you prefer. Look at your processing times and make sure your jars are covered by the water in that water bath by at least 1 inch. 1 to 2 inches is recommended. I'm going to move to pressure canning now. So again, pressure canning is a must for low acid foods like green beans, squash, carrots, any meats and soups, even if it's a tomato soup, because it has other things in it, garlic, and so to be safe you need to pressure can any soups you make. As I mentioned before, foods low in acid sealed in an anaerobic canning jar is a haven for Clostridium botulinum. Home canning gone wrong is the biggest cause of adult botulism. So why can't you just use a water bath canner and just boil the dickens out of it for a longer period of time? Well, the answer lies with physics. And physics says it really doesn't work that way. So to make my point clearer, I wanted to talk a little bit about the physics behind boiling and altitude and pressure. Water boils at 212 degrees at sea level. In Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, the elevation is about 1,300 feet above sea level. At our elevation, water boils at just 209 degrees. The spores of Clostridium botulinum survive up to temperatures of nearly 200 degrees. So in order to kill the spores, it's recommended that we get the temperature within our jars up to about 240 degrees. So your water temperature in your water bath canner does not just keep getting hotter as you boil longer. It's going to stay around whatever temperature the boiling point is at your particular elevation and barometric pressure, which here is only 209 degrees. So we're not getting close enough to 240 degrees. So no matter how long you boil the water bath water, you just aren't going to reach that 240 degrees without adding pressure to your canning system. So this is where the pressure canner enters into the picture. Pressure builds up from the steam in a sealed container, like a pressure canner, and that will allow you to get the temperature high enough to kill the Clostridium botulinum. So this is why you need a pressure canner for foods that are at risk of harboring the botulism spores. So an easier method, freezing. Freezing is the easiest and it's the most widely used methods of food preservation. Freezing retains the nutrients very well, better than other methods. If you find that canning is intimidating or more work than you really want to go to, try freezing your green beans, your carrots, your beets, all those things that you would need a pressure canner for. Freezing works well for most of those things. Vegetables are usually blanched to stop the enzyme activity, which would lead to spoilage. Blanching also helps preserve the color. They stay bright and appetizing looking. Frozen vegetables keep their quality and flavor for about a year if you blanch them. You can also freeze vegetables that are cooked completely, like leftovers after a meal. You can freeze those. The quality may not last as long as if you were just blanching them, but 3 to 4 months is considered good, and after that it's not going to harm the safe, it's not going to be unsafe to eat them, but the quality, you might notice a little decrease in quality or maybe some freezer burn or just drier than what you like. So now I'm going to move on to jams and jellies. And if you have never canned before, jams and jellies are a great place to start because it's really very easy, but they're water bath canned, and it can just really get you started on the road to canning, give you a little success there, and find how great that this product tastes, and maybe give you incentive to try bigger and better things, maybe even pressure canning. Many fruits have their own pectin within the fruit, and they thicken on their own when you cook them down. And that was the jams that we talked about during 500 BC, how they would preserve their old fruits. Today, pectins are harvested from fruits, and they're sold in a box in the grocery store, and then you add that to your fruits or fruit juices to get a better gel. Traditional pectins require sugar to gel properly. And it takes lots of sugar. So it's about a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar to fruit in order to get a gel. So that makes them maybe a concern for people who are trying to watch their sugar, or you tend to run on the diabetic side. There are low sugar pectins sold, and they do require less sugar, but it isn't really what I would call low sugar. There's still plenty of sugar in there. But I wanted to tell you that nowadays there are pectins that depend on calcium to gel. Pomona's is one brand that I have used personally. So not requiring sugar to get a gel means that you can significantly reduce the sugar in your jams. And you can actually add no sugar at all if your fruit is sweet enough for you. Jams made in this way are best frozen though, rather than canned. And that's because if you can them, they tend to not hold their color. And after several months to a year, they become kind of brown and unappetizing looking. It won't hurt you, it doesn't hurt the quality or safety, but it just doesn't look great on your toast. So what I recommend is that, and it is recommended by extension offices, is that type of jelly jam, you would freeze it. You'd make a freezer jam out of it, and then that really preserves that bright color and fruit taste. And so you're tasting the actual fruit rather than so much sugar. So this presentation has been a brief overview. There's too much detailed food preservation information to impart here. If you have specific questions regarding food preservation, the Becker County Master Gardeners are a very good resource. You may contact us by calling 218-846-7328 or emailing mnext-becker@umn.edu. Your inquiries will be directed to a food preservation consultant like myself, who can answer your questions and offer advice. This concludes today's presentation. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you found this information both interesting and useful.